Thank you all for coming today. It's a beautiful day. We've got a really great speaker lined up for you. You've seen the flyers out there. Professor Jeanne Liedtke is here from the University of Virginia's Darden's Graduate School of Business. She's a professor of management, and you're going to see that she's got some really neat concepts to present to us. You know, we think about the future of the organization. We think about the future of NASA and the future of even Langley, and a lot of strategic planning goes into place to think about how we're going to get to the vision that we have for ourselves. We also hire great folks like you who are experts in your disciplines, who have deep subject matter expertise. And sometimes we throw you into a team and it works, and sometimes it doesn't work, and we scratch our heads, well, why didn't it work? Why didn't this team produce and this one did? And so then we come and we say, well, they need some soft skills. They need to learn how to play together. And so we teach you some courses like team dynamics and those sorts of things. And now we've taught you soft skills, and you've got the good hard discipline skills that you have. We put you back together, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. And so we scratch our heads and say, why doesn't it work? And what you're going to hear about today, design thinking, is kind of a step back further than that. In addition to your hard and soft skills, there are some other skills that you're going to bring to bear to work together to solve problems, to come up with solutions. And you know the agency definitely needs some solutions to the grand challenges that we face. To put humans on Mars in the 2030s is just an amazing challenge that needs a lot of breakthroughs. You know, if we try to incrementally change the technologies that we're working on right now, we're not going to get there. We need some innovations both within your disciplines and at the concept and architecture levels. And so what you're going to look at today is a way to think about collaborative team solving, innovation, problem solving, coming up with solutions that is more than just looking at your soft skills or more than just looking at your hard skills. And not just putting the two together and hope it works. It is a methodology that I think can really change the way we come up with the future technologies and missions for the agency. So I'm really excited to have Professor Liedtke here today. She's been previously the executive director of the Baton Institute, which is a foundation established for the leadership in the fields of entrepreneurship and corporate innovation. She's also served as the Chief Learning Officer of the United Technologies Corporation. She's written 4 books on the topics of innovation, growth, and design thinking. And so we're really excited that Karen's invited her. Most of you know Marty Wyzak, who's the Deputy Chief Technologist on the Center. He actually was a student of Professor Liedtke's, and that relationship has helped bring her here today. So please join me in giving her a warm welcome as she presents her talk, Design Thinking, a Methodology for Collaborative Problem Solving.
Well, it's terrific to be here. Normally, I'm speaking to a business audience, so it's a special treat for me to be here talking to a more technical audience, because I always joke that, I love engineers. I'm sorry, because we teach a lot of business people, a lot of marketing people, and people who consider themselves very creative and innovative. And we always joke that on the Monday morning after class ends, everybody in marketing goes back to their office and does whatever they were doing before they started class. Whereas the engineers go back to their office and immediately start drawing flowcharts for how they're going to implement what it is we've talked about. So I think a lot of what I'll be talking about today is a structured process. And it's the very structured nature of the process, I think, that creates a lot of the value it brings to decision making. In my research, I've studied a lot of business people who are naturally very good at innovation and organic growth. Right? It has to do in part with how they're hardwired. But we find much more frequently that, especially for those of us who've grown up in more technical areas and are more specialized, I'm an accountant by training myself, my undergrad, a lot of the behaviors associated with innovation and growth don't come as naturally to us. So in many ways, I think what we're talking about here is understanding the set of practices that lead to the kind of outcomes we want, and then figuring out how to make those practices comfortable for some of us who just have kind of a different orientation. I think that turns out to be particularly important because increasingly we live in a world of wicked problems. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term wicked problems, but no, it did not originate in Boston. Wicked problems were first talked about by a designer, Horst Strattel, who argued really back in the late 40s, early 50s, that as the world was becoming more complex and more uncertain, this traditional linear problem-solving approach that we developed and that we rely almost exclusively on was just increasingly less useful. So if we think about a traditional problem-solving approach, for instance, that we teach our MBAs, we teach, okay, first, start, define the problem, lay out the set of alternatives, analyze the alternatives to select the optimal one, and then implement it. Well, let's just start with the first problem, define the problem. In a wicked problem, people can't even agree on the definition of the problem, much less the definition of a solution, right? And particularly as we get in increasingly complex stakeholder environments where we're working with people coming from very different places politically, different places in terms of specialized expertise, different places of what they think is important, right? Even defining the problem presents huge challenges in a decision-making process. Then we move to identify the solutions. Well, increasingly, the obvious solutions that we can easily identify, we already know are incapable of solving the problem we've got, right? The whole point is to generate a set of solutions that don't currently exist. Then we move to analysis, right? Well, just analyze them and pick the optimal one. Well, this whole notion of optimization requires agreement on the criteria, right? And when we bring diverse stakeholder groups together who don't even agree on the problem, they usually definitely don't agree on the criteria for what makes for a good solution. Right? So even this simple step of analysis, we often find turns into a period of negotiation that sub-optimizes in the extreme. I mean, we know that negotiation is an extremely poor strategy for arriving at higher order solutions. It's okay if it's just a kind of a quid pro quo and the important thing is we get out of the room and we get on with our work. But when we're trying for breakthrough thinking, getting into an environment where we start making trade-offs just so that everyone in the room will let us go forward doesn't really work at all. So these wicked problems we're dealing with, an issue like, for instance, in the US, healthcare, right? Clearly a wicked problem that we don't all agree on the definition of. Is the problem of healthcare one of access, or is the problem of healthcare one of cost? Right? We come at it from very different places, and when we try and solve these problems linearly as though they were tame, is the language that Rattel used, we come up with highly unsatisfactory solutions. So how then do we deal with wicked problems? Well, the argument is that in order to really understand a wicked problem, we have to invest the time in deeply understanding the problem itself. And of course, as decision makers, particularly in the world I come from in business, we want to be decisive, and we're always in a hurry. We want to pick a solution, and then we want to implement it, right? So in fact, we think that the innovation process starts with brainstorming, when in fact, a good innovation process doesn't brainstorm until at least halfway through, right? Because it's our understanding of the problem, it's the uncovering of novel insights about what's happening today that provides the raw material to inspire creative solutions. So I just want to talk a little bit about that today. I want to talk a little bit about why design thinking. I want to talk first a little bit about what design thinking is. How many people in the room feel like they have kind of a clear understanding of what we mean when we say design thinking? Well, Marty took my class, so if he didn't raise his hand, that would be really serious. But very few, right? It's this kind of murky, weird term, right? So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about what it is, why it's important, what it's capable of, and then towards the end, segue into this particular topic of collaboration. Because even though a lot of the attention in the business press around design thinking is around this belief that it's important because it provides better ultimate solutions, right? And it increases the quality of the solution itself. I've actually come through my research and work with managers at least to believe that an equally powerful outcome lies with the way it facilitates team process. Right? So it isn't just the outcome itself. It's the improvements it allows you to make in the way particularly diverse teams that are working across difference, can come together to make things happen, to work together to come up with not negotiated lower order solutions, but breakthrough higher order solutions that are better than what anyone entered the room with coming from their own area of specialization. Right? So let's just start a little bit talking about innovation. And of course, in the business world, when you talk about innovation, you always have to start with Apple. Right? I always joke that that we owe Steve Jobs and Apple for both the wonderful benefit that everyone wants to talk about innovation in business and the awful benefit that they all have the completely wrong conception of what it actually is constituted of. But we start with Apple, when asked to draw the picture of innovation, this is what one of their creative people drew. Right? And often, I love this drawing, because to me, it captures exactly what many of us really believe about the process of breakthrough innovation. That it, in fact, is alchemy. It's a black box. It's this mysterious thing. And someone starts with a question, and then certain categories of individuals are able to miraculously come up with these wonderful answers. And when I say miraculous, I mean it. I think of the Moses myth, is what I call it. And the Moses myth is this notion that when we need innovation, we go and find a holy man who has a special relationship with God. And when it's time to part the Red Sea, that person kind of raises their staff and a miracle occurs. Right? And we have our innovation. Right? But I often think, particularly in the business world, really looking to Apple and companies like that and the idea of the lone creative genius of Steve Jobs, it is like looking to Moses for advice on how to cross a river. About the only advice you get is to go find somebody who can perform miracles. I think of design thinking as helping us build a bridge to cross the river. Right? It's a lot less sexy than just parting the waters with your staff. No question about that. But it's also a lot more reliable. And it's a lot more accessible as a methodology for what most of us can do. So what I like about design thinking is the message is we don't, in business organizations, have to spend all of our time looking for the creative geniuses. We can actually take the rest of us who are already working there and equip people with the process and tools that will not turn them into Steve Jobs any more than a few golf lessons is going to turn us into Tiger Woods, but will dramatically improve our ability to up our own game at this process. So I want to tell a little bit of a background story on my research and why I believe design thinking is so useful. So most of my original research, I'm a business strategy person, right? Not really an innovation person by training. One of the things that always troubled me as a strategy professor is managers' number one concern, usually when you ask them what strategic challenge they'd like help with in their business, is they say, well, I need to grow my business. What are some frameworks and tools and all that I can use to grow my business? And the reality of it is, almost all the tools we've had in strategy traditionally have been about how to analyze your business. How to actually generate the ideas to grow your business. Well, that was that hairball that we looked at a little bit earlier, right? Very few methodologies there. But boy, once you had an idea, we could analyze the crap out of it, with 18 different technologies, right? And we find, as we looked at managers in our research, so we set off to do research on, well, maybe if we isolated the people who are really good at this and we observed their behaviors, we could figure out if they're doing anything different than the rest of us. And then maybe we could teach that to the people for whom it wasn't that natural. So that's where we started off. And we got to know very well there a manager that I'll call George. So we'll tell you the story of two managers. George, high achiever, okay? George often comes to business out of, say, an engineering undergrad, technical person, very smart. The guy who's used to getting the A, right? And really, that's his outlook on life. Right? It's about doing a great job. It's about getting the right answers. It's about performing well. Well, what happens to George is he figures out that the way to get the A, the way not to be wrong, is to limit your exposure to uncertainty. When you think about it, as soon as you step from the environment where you already know what you're doing and all the answers into an uncertain world, your odds of being wrong go up. Right? There's just no way around that. So it is a completely logical behavior that if you've been raised to think what's important is getting the right answer, and incidentally, that smart people get the right answer, and that if you get the wrong answer, it just has demonstrated that you're really not that smart, you will learn that the way to look smart all the time is to limit your exposure to uncertainty. As a result of that, when you look at how George makes career choices, and there's a lot of young folks in here, I said that there's a lot more positive messages in this for those of you who are young. For those of us who are old, I keep saying I'm like one of those oven stuffer roasters and my little done thing is popped. You know, it's like, you know, you're doing remedial work for anything you didn't pick up. But for young people, what happens with George is he selects these progressive career experiences. He joins an organization in manufacturing, and he gets really good at it, right? And after a while, he becomes the expert. He develops an expert repertoire, right? Very deep knowledge in his subject. He's the go-to person, we would say, in business. Now, if George wants to move up, though, at some point he has to become a general manager, right? He has to take on responsibility for business and profit and loss, which means now instead of expertise in this kind of narrow channel, he's expected to lead in a broader way. Well, what happens then? Well, George goes after data, right? Because he realizes in our world of business, you have to serve your customers, right? And in order to serve your customers, you have to know your customers. So he gathers a lot of data on customers. Right? And then he learns to focus on a few clear ideas, to reduce risk through careful analysis, to make some calculated investments, and as a result, he makes consistent progress, and that confirms for him this view of the world. Let's look what happens to George in a world of innovation and growth. As soon as we tee up innovation and growth as the goal that he must meet, the behaviors that contributed to his success in the stable world begin to contribute instead to his failure in an unstable one. So in the unstable environment, suddenly life feels like a test, and George spends all of his time trying not to look stupid. Right? There's some wonderful work that some of you may be familiar with by a Stanford psychologist named Carol Dweck. She's written a book called Mindsets. It's actually quite popular. She studies elementary school children exclusively, but it's interesting. I think her insights tell us more about what mature adults in organizations, where their problems come from in innovation, than almost any of the actual business research, for instance, I would look at. But she argues that somewhere early in our educational process, some of us, like George, pick up what she will call a fixed mindset. And with a fixed mindset, we learn early on that the purpose of life is not to look stupid, right? To look smart. And that has a set of consequences associated with it. So think back to when you were in elementary school, right? Some of us learn very quickly, if you're not sure you have the right answer, don't put your hand up, right? And in fact, one of Dweck's criticisms is of a lot of public school systems in the US that she feels push children into this mindset. And in fact, if we look around the world, there are educational systems that do this much more dramatically even than we do. When you emphasize rote learning, when you emphasize the right answer, when you emphasize smart equals right answer, you get a whole set of behaviors that will really create problems for George. Because he's been taught to fear uncertainty, and it's not an irrational fear. It's a completely rational fear if my goal is to not make mistakes. But as a result of that, he avoids broadening experiences. Right, where he would have to make a decision, step out of his comfort zone. As a result of that, what we called an expert repertoire, we now call a narrow repertoire. And repertoire turns out to be incredibly important in the world of business innovation, at least as we look at it, because it turns out that very little business innovation comes from something wholly new created out of nothing. Yes, technology-driven innovation is incredibly important. And I guess this would be a good time to mention that it's really not what I study. Right? Technology-driven innovation, the science of that, right, it's kind of a world that for most working managers has very little relevance to them, right? They don't work in the R&D department. They don't drive technology breakthroughs. If they want to grow and innovate, chances are most innovation comes from a recombination of existing ideas or an idea that you transport from one industry to another. So your ability to see opportunity, to identify new innovations, is hugely dependent upon what you have already seen and the breadth of your repertoire. Right? So limited repertoire turns out to be an incredible disadvantage when we start to look for growth opportunities. That's compounded by the fact that when I see the people I'm working with, the customers or stakeholders, only as data points, my knowledge of them is very superficial. Right? I mean, how much depth of knowledge can you really get out of a survey asking people what they think? We know from years of psychology research, people don't really know what they think. Right? People, even in focus groups, if you show them a prototype and say, will you buy this, are wrong 50% of the time. Completely incapable of actually even guessing when we're looking at something whether we'll actually buy it. Right? So all the survey methodology is good where you've got a highly reliable, extensive existing database, but as soon as you move into innovation, asking people what they want is usually a complete waste of time, right? It's very expensive. It's actually a major source of risk in innovation. You ask people what you want, they tell you, you go spend money, and then you finally spend the money, and then they didn't want it when it turns out, right? So this is probably the biggest issue in business. So you've got this very superficial understanding of people based on asking them stuff. When you combine a limited repertoire with a superficial understanding of context, guaranteed good ideas will be few. Right? And then we compound them by trying to manage risk through analysis, when in fact the whole point of innovation is to create a future that looks different from the past. So why you think you should be able to get there by extrapolating from data from a past that you hope becomes obsolete is a mystery to me, but in fact it's the methodology that we accept as logical, right, in the business world. So you put all of this together, George ends up placing very big risky bets. It's counterintuitive, but in his desire to minimize risk and make sure he's not wrong, his behaviors result in exactly the opposite. They magnify the risk he's taken, and they greatly increase the chances of being wrong. Think about it. One of the analogies we talk a lot about is that when you're innovating in a field, you're actually in business much more like a venture capitalist than you are like someone who's maintaining a business. And if we went out to Silicon Valley and found the truly outstandingly successful venture capitalists, when they invested in 10 projects, what would we expect their hit rate to be? 2 at highest. 1 is more like it. Right? So people who do this for a living succeed 2 out of 10 times. Right? And yet George has probably picked one idea and totally doubled down on it. Right? The odds of getting it right are practically non-existent. Right? So in the end, he ends up failing and failing publicly. And this just activates all his anxiety and proves to him that this is like an incredibly awful thing to have to go innovate and we shouldn't do it. If we compare George, though, with another manager, really the managers who emerge in our study is very good at this, somewhere along the line, Jeff, in that same elementary school probably, picks up a completely different message. And the message he picks up is that life is a journey of learning. And that it's okay to be wrong as long as you learn. And that if you are persistent and disciplined and continue to work hard at something, you will get smarter, you will get better. As a result of that, he's accepting of uncertainty. In fact, we find that if you take for instance, take a young person and 3 years into their career, they're an engineer, they joined in research and development. You think they're a high potential person and you say to them, well, George, you look like the kind of person who could really be a leader around here. How about working in marketing for a few years to kind of round you out? George will say, work in marketing? I don't know anything about marketing. Why would I want to do that? Right? Whereas Jeff will say, marketing? I don't know anything about marketing. That sounds really great. Right? So part of it is exactly the same circumstances, but people making different choices because what's driving them. One set of behaviors is driven by avoidance. Right? I would rather not act if that action might lead me to be wrong. The other behavior is driven by a willingness to act, knowing you'll be wrong, but thinking the consequences of acting are worth being wrong. Right? You can't innovate if you're trying to avoid behaviors. Right? I mean, we know this is the first problem with innovation. Someone doesn't step into the space if their basic instincts are to avoid being wrong, because no logical person would walk out into the world of uncertainty if they're logical, if they're really trying to avoid uncertainty. So this set of decisions impacts Jeff at every stage of his life. He seeks new experiences because he wants to learn, right? So that by the time we meet him, he may not be seen as highly technically expert in any one area, but he has a very broad repertoire. Right? And that broad repertoire is the foundation for seeing opportunities. He also has a different way of dealing with people. Probably some of you have heard a lot of discussion of this term empathy. You know, the other day someone said empathy was the new source of competitive advantage, which really starts to scare you, right? So now we're really going to know people really deeply, so we can really manipulate them much more effectively to buy our products, right? It's kind of a scary thing. But the reality of it is, if we're trying to explore new territory, the easy, obvious answers and the easy, obvious understanding of the people we're working with won't get us there. We actually need to be able to identify people's unarticulated needs, even though they're incapable of telling us them. Right? And the kind of market research tools you use to do this are quite different. So, and I won't go into those now because that's not really something that's a particular area of interest to you. But let me just say that when you combine a broad repertoire with someone who's able to read unarticulated needs in a group empathetically, you have someone who can find a lot of growth opportunities in exactly the same situation where the other person saw none. The other thing we observed in these managers is they've learned to manage risk through action. They know that extrapolating yesterday's numbers don't work. The only way to learn is through active experimentation. Right? And you would think that active experimentation would be obvious, but certainly in the business area, we're really bad at actually conducting experiments other than involving Excel spreadsheets and extrapolating historic data. Because he manages risk through action, he places a lot of small bets quickly, right? So now we're managing a portfolio of new ideas. And the challenge, the real trick is not just to figure out which 10 ideas to invest in, but to figure out which 8 ideas to stop investing in as soon as possible, right? And of course, the risk is that based on early returns, you stop investing in the ones you should have kept investing in, right? So it's a significant challenge. But at any rate, we find these are the people who succeed more often in innovation. Well, what's interesting to me, you're looking at a set of behaviors. You're looking at a mindset, which is kind of accepting of error and a belief that discipline and continued effort and paying attention to feedback are really critical to success. You're looking at people who are interacting with other people in a very different way, trying to understand what the worldview of that person is, understand through the lens of their view of the world what's happening as a precondition for trying to create value for them. And then you're looking at people who are placing, we call small bets quickly, or taking a highly experimental view towards what they're doing. So turns out, when you actually look at the behaviors of designers, they look a lot like the behaviors of Jeff. The difference being, Jeff does it all intuitively, and designers do it with process and tools. So a lot of where I come from in terms of my interest in design thinking has been driven out of this research to suggest that, you know, you can spend your time trying to find and hire all of the Jeffs in the world, but the reality of it is most people, at least in business organizations, are George. And really marshaling innovative energy means helping George to get more comfortable with a set of behaviors that right now he's going to naturally find uncomfortable, right? And that, to me, is why design thinking is so useful, because I think of it as just a systematic approach to problem solving. It's just a problem-solving methodology, but it's a problem-solving methodology characterized by a few things that are quite different than the way we would normally decide issues in strategy. First, it's empathy-driven. It starts by establishing a deep understanding of human needs. Right? Another word for this is just user-driven design. Right? I think it's interesting to think about, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on where technology-driven design and user-driven design meets. Right? But I think even in technology-driven design, one of the issues is as soon as we begin to cross boundaries, right? As soon as, even from a technology viewpoint, we're dealing with problems that are wicked rather than tame, the human element of empathy and of establishing an understanding of the worldview of the other person becomes essential to working together to create higher order solutions. So we'll talk some more about the role of that. The second aspect of design thinking is it starts with possibilities. The traditional notion in design is that all great designs occur at the intersection of three things. The first is possibilities. The question is, what if anything were possible? The second is constraints. We know that anything isn't possible, and we have to factor them in. And the third is uncertainties. We know that our predictions will be wrong, and we need to factor in contingencies for if it turns out a prediction that's critical to us is wrong. One of the challenges we've got in business is overwhelmingly we start the process with constraints. And if you start a process for designing a future with constraints, you just never get to possibilities, right? Incremental change is all you see. So design thinking is very explicit in the front part of the process, the kind of fuzzy front end, as designers call it. It is entirely possibility driven. We don't really let constraints significantly into the conversation at all. We ask the question, what if anything were possible? What would we create? And we really go deep to try and understand what that would look like. And then after we've got a portfolio of answers to what that might look like, then we begin to layer in the constraints in a hypothesis testing process. But one of the things that we know is that most of us cannot think generatively about creating new ideas simultaneously with testing those ideas. So it becomes really critical that hypothesis generation and testing become sequential, not simultaneous. Right? So that's a lot of what we'll talk about with possibilities. And then finally, there's this notion of iteration. There is no belief whatsoever that you will actually get it right the first time. What the first solution is a toehold into a learning process, right? But any solution is treated as a hypothesis until we've had a chance to actually test all the critical assumptions underneath it, in which case we may be ready to call it truth and actually scale it up into something significant. As we've looked at this process of design thinking, one of the challenges that we discovered early on is that even though these techniques have been around and talked about for a very long time, I mean, you know, you would think that IDEO just arrived with the creation of the mouse, but in fact, it's been a long time. There have been product development designers for a very long time who have used a lot of these techniques and processes. They all tend to call them something different the way consultants do. But when we looked at the work they were doing, we felt that there was great commonality in the process and tools. The trouble was they weren't very accessible to managers, right? They were designers talking to designers. And even when you have like the popular business press books written by like Tim Brown of IDEO, they give very high-level abstract examples that don't really help anyone figure out how to do this stuff. So one of the things that we've spent a lot of time on is trying to develop a concrete problem-solving approach that would be accessible to people who are not trained as designers. And essentially, when you look at what designers do, they ask 4 questions, right? The first question is, what is? And it is having to do with developing a very deep understanding of today's context and the situation users today are facing, right? Only after we've developed that do we get to ask the what if question, which is, if anything were possible, what would we actually create for these users? Right? Then we begin to do the testing stages. What wows is kind of what I think of in business. We do a lot of thought experiments, right? Unlike science, it helps to do experiments out of data you've got if you possibly can. So we begin to layer in the constraints at that point. Organizational constraints about resources and capabilities, constraints about what partners are able to produce and what they will do with you. We begin to allow constraints to narrow our range of alternatives. But eventually what we've got is a divergent process that says, go out there, think possibilities, generate a lot of ideas, and then in a divergent process, narrow down those ideas progressively into a smaller and smaller set that you move into more and more and more expensive forms of implementation and experimentation. And again, what we find is we could go into designers who have hundreds of tools, of course. These are the 10 that we've selected, at least for business model innovation, we think are the most useful. So for instance, tool number 1, and it's kind of a spanning tool, is this notion of visualization. Right? Now, to someone who works in science, visualization is obvious, right? We would never think of just using text to capture things. We would use flowcharts and diagrams and all kinds of visual descriptions of things. We know that visuals provide a scaffolding for people to achieve clarity and alignment and work together. Right? Business, not so much, right? We're used to PowerPoints with 4 bullet points on them. And so this notion of introducing visualization, of pushing towards clarity that can be shared and making tacit assumptions about what we're all talking about clearer, turns out to be really important. One of the methodologies that's most useful in our work is journey mapping. Journey mapping is where we map the journey of someone trying to get a job done. Right? The classic story here in business is people, when we go out and we move into a new apartment and we go to hang our pictures, we may have to go out and buy a drill. But the reality of it is we haven't bought a drill because we actually want to own a drill. We've bought a drill because we need a hole. Right? And so the emphasis needs to be on, or the identity is, I'm someone who sells holes, not drills. Right? That turns out to be really important because if I get too fixated on myself as someone who makes and sells drills, guess what? I forget that they're really only there for one purpose. And as soon as someone comes up with a better way to accomplish that end, then I'm toast. So this notion of journey mapping says, let's look at the job someone's trying to get done. Let's look at all aspects of getting that job done, the places where we play and the places where we don't. And then let's understand their emotional as well as their functional journey. Right? Because it turns out that if this is really about creating value for human beings, which is what this is inherently about, this methodology, that human beings are not robots. They have specifications other than the merely technical. And even, for instance, in a company like a Northrop Grumman or a United Technologies, companies that are highly technically driven company operating in the B2B space, the business-to-business space, even there, unless your products are purchased by robots, there's tremendous opportunity to create value for people by understanding both the emotional and the technical journey they're going on in the process. Some of the tools are pretty familiar. Brainstorming and concept development tools have been around for a long time. These are more structured approaches to brainstorming, so instead of putting people in a room and having everyone shout out their 10 novel uses of the paperclip, people actually write things down and you give them trigger questions. And most of all, you don't let anyone brainstorm until at the end of the what is process, you've created a clear set of design criteria to brainstorm with. So what we're talking about is data-driven brainstorming at that point, right? Based on what you've learned in the first process. And then we move into some pretty traditional assumption testing, rapid prototyping, co-creation, which turns out to be really critical. If the biggest risk in my world is spending a lot of investment to create a product that it turns out no one wants, then the easiest way to remove that risk is to invite them into the creation process with you. right? So this question of how we facilitate people working together to co-create, this notion of collaborative creation, is a really important one. And I'll talk about some of the obstacles to that in a minute. And then finally, what we've called learning launches, which are just small in-market experiments. All right. You know, it turned out after we created this and worked with people, a couple of hundred managers for a few years, this wasn't enough. George actually even needed more structure than this because people have trouble navigating from one tool to the other. So I do journey mapping, and I've got data, but I'm not really sure how to translate that into something that's design criteria that moves into the what if. So at this point, we've ended up identifying a very concrete set of activities to help people move through this process. And when you read them, they are completely self-evident. And yet, it turns out to be very helpful to people to be this specific. And you know, for anyone who's interested, we've got a lot more information on this stuff to talk about. Because what I want to go to is to talk a little bit more about why design thinking is useful then. So we step up. So the first thing we've talked about is design thinking can really help those of us who are more like George, who are uncomfortable with uncertainty and stepping into that space. It can create a sense of psychological safety. And we know that from a lot of research in psychology, this concept of psychological safety is critically important for learning to occur, right? Anxiety is a terrible inhibitor of learning. Okay, even though we've all seen, you know, the scene from Apollo 13 where, you know, everybody dumps the box on the table. That's actually not normally what inspires most people to be more creative. Most of us in that situation would just turn into slobbering idiots, right? Who would do the same thing over and over again because we're so freaked out by the enormity of the time pressure and the consequences if we fail that really there are very few people that would actually rise to the occasion on that. For most of us, the single easiest way to improve our ability to think creatively is to reduce our anxiety. So the more we can create process and systems and environments for people that makes them less anxious as they step into the unknown, less concerned about being wrong, the more creative they will be. Interestingly enough, I think some of the most interesting work being done in psychology right now is around positive affect and the incredible benefits of positive affect. You know, it makes its way into the popular literature with all the happiness stuff, right? We're all reading about happiness. But I mean, take happiness aside, just talk about positive affect. People who are in a good mood. It turns out that the benefits of getting people in a reasonably good mood instead of a bad mood are overwhelming. Not just for creativity, for their ability to listen more carefully, for their ability to work across difference, all kinds of crazy stuff. So as leaders, as we think about how to create work environments where people do their best work, it becomes really critical to think about how we help them to feel better and to feel more of a sense of satisfaction in the work they do. So I think that's a really important aspect of design thinking. Another, and I'm not going to talk about this much, because it's kind of a whole world unto itself, is if we look at the cognitive bias literature, I mean, there's decades, you know, Kahneman and Tversky, you know, there's a lot of work on cognitive bias. There's a very clear set of cognitive biases, and this is one of those charts where it looks really good on the screen, you know, of your laptop, and then it looks terrible here. But I did forget to mention, I'll make the PowerPoints available, so, you know, don't worry about what's up there. But in fact, you know, decision researchers have identified a very clear set of cognitive biases, from the projection bias to the planning fallacy, hypothesis confirmation bias, all kinds of ways in which we are horribly flawed as human decision makers. Right? And actually, if we look at design thinking and methodologies like visualization, the use of ethnography, this idea of forcing multiple option creation, of ideating with a diverse group, and we'll talk a little bit more about the role of diversity, of prototyping, assumption testing, all of these specific tools act directly to reduce cognitive bias. Right? So at some level, we get better decisions using a process like this just because it helps us avoid some of the most common biases, like projecting our own opinion onto someone else without really realizing we're doing it, right? Which is what we all do. But let's look at some of the other benefits. So the other clear benefit, I think, is we're now trying to design with data in an innovative form as opposed to just kind of making it up. And even more than that, this notion of facilitating team learning and collaboration. And I want to spend a little bit of time, since that's what I promised to talk about in the first place, talking a little bit about why it is I believe that design thinking is useful for this. But first, we have to talk about what happens when we try and work collaboratively in diverse teams. I think of the challenge of innovation and the paradox of diversity. The paradox of diversity is that we absolutely know higher order solutions come from people who think differently. When you put people who've been trained the same way, raised in the same kind of practice, in a room and tell them to create something, we are hopelessly prisoners of the mental models that have been formed by our training. Right? And increasingly in all areas, not just in business, but we know in science as well, the significant breakthroughs occur across specialties. The dilemma being that even though we know the potential for breakthrough solutions comes from diversity, the reality of it is the more diverse the team, the higher the probability that they will underperform, because all that difference gets in the way. Right? It's a joy to work with people who all think exactly like you do. Right? It's fast, it's efficient, it feels good. Put a bunch of people in the room who think very differently than you do, and all of a sudden it gets very painful very quickly. So there's a fair amount of academic research that suggests, though in laboratory settings you can put together diverse groups and actually demonstrate superior solutions, in reality, in the field, almost always, the additional processing time it takes means that you actually turn out that diverse teams underperform other teams. Right? So that's the paradox. We know we need diversity, but it gets in the way of our decision-making processes. Why? Because the current processes we've got are just inadequate for most of us to navigate the challenges that a diverse perspectives bring into the conversation. So at some level, if it were just as simple as coordinating across specialized boundaries, which is kind of where we start with this, right? Well, you have a diverse team, you've got a bunch of specialists, and you need to coordinate across boundaries. We might not be that bad, but the reality of it is the task to be done, if innovation and breakthrough thinking is the goal, is much more complex than mere coordination. So for instance, people have to navigate significant complexity. They have to learn and create new knowledge, right? If only we could create breakthroughs by just coordinating existing knowledge, but it doesn't work that way, right? People have to work together in ways that push us all to a higher level decision. Lots of complications. Part of that requires developing shared intent. So this processes for how we align people around, first of all, a common definition of the problem in order to attack the problem become really important. And then finally, one of the things that we find most critical, left to their own devices, almost all specialties will immediately move into debate mode when confronted with someone with a different perspective. We're taught to debate. I mean, in fact, most of us are raised to be debaters. Most school systems reward debating. Right? And so as a result, we get very good at listening for the flaws in someone else's argument rather than listening to understand where they're coming from or in listening for the possibilities. So as we look at this, I just pulled a couple of quotes from the literature on team learning that I found interesting. And actually, this is one from science, not business, arguing that when complexity and novelty are linked, routines often fail. So we all develop routines in our own practices. The dilemma is when things get complex and when we have to work across practices, the routines we've established no longer work. Arriving at novel constructions in the face of such complexity is more than just coordination. It also changes the fundamental nature of the work within the discipline. So one of the dilemmas we have is we can't just do our work the way we've already done it and toss it over to those other specialties, right? Literally, when we work together effectively, we have to change the way we work even within our domain in order to successfully cross domains. very difficult to do. Then when we get to creating knowledge, the challenge here, and we know, the old notion of knowledge used to be that it was information processing, it was taking in information. But we know now very clearly that learning is a social phenomena. Learning and new knowledge creation almost always requires the presence of challenges to our existing way of thinking, right? So it occurs across domains, and these domains are not just content specialized, right? They're also what the researchers here will call interpretive, which is we've been taught to see the world differently, right? And that seeing of the world differently is tacit often. We don't even understand how differently we see the world than the person sitting next to us, right? We merely accept the way we see the world. That's the way we've been taught. In order to work together, we have to successfully not just transfer information across specialized expertise. We have to translate across these different languages we've been taught to speak. And then we've got politics, right? We have to rise above the political differences that we brought into the situation. So beyond specialized content and even translation across our lexicon is this need to kind of align behind a common idea. And then finally, this notion of the role of dialogue. If we believe that creating new categories or new distinctions is really what creates new knowledge, the trouble is our perceptions are governed by these distinctions we're raised with, so they're tacit. It's really only by gaining distance that we can have critical insights that facilitate new distinctions. Dialogue is critical to accomplishing this because it's only when confronted by someone else's different set of categories that we can begin to gain insight into our own. Right? Higher order solutions almost always happen when we reorganize the categories that our knowledge lives in. Right? But our categories are invisible to us, and they're invisible to groups who have the same categories. Right? It's really only being confronted by these different categories that we're jogged into seeing different ways of organizing what we know, which often allow us to access different kinds of possibilities. Right? But it's painful, right? There's nothing worse than having your categories challenged. Right? It's pretty fundamental to the way we are. So dialogue is critical to accomplishing this. And let me just talk a little bit about dialogue versus debate. Again, when we think about how we are taught, we have different ideas. I listen to your ideas, but I know mine are right. So as I'm listening to your ideas, I'm just listening for the flaws in them, right? So that when you stop talking, I can start talking and tell you everything's wrong with what you just came up with, right? Well, the dilemma there is the other person is doing exactly the same thing. So they're listening for the flaws in our argument. So when I stop talking, you can see quickly, you're just in a death spiral there. Right, where everyone's only listening to the reasons why someone else's ideas are flawed, and eventually we're just so exhausted by debating each other that we compromise, right? And we come up with what, I'll talk in a minute, Herb Simon won the Nobel Prize in Economics for coining the term satisficing. We pretend to optimize, but in fact, where most groups with diversity end up is satisficing, defined as selecting the least worst alternative everyone will agree to. Right? You don't get breakthrough thinking by selecting the least worst alternative everyone will agree to. But at some point, fatigue sets in, right? And we're unable to access the higher order stuff. So let's look at how design thinking helps us do that. First, let me argue, it helps groups do this because it keeps them in the question. And this process begins, if you start debating at the solutions level, you're already dead in the water. If you've achieved alignment on the nature of the question, your odds of success go way up. This is a quote I like from our research by, this is a group of people in the city of Dublin who've been using design thinking to engage citizens in urban revitalization. And he argues, even in this world, the tendency to jump to solutions far too quickly is a big problem. Design thinking forces you to live in the unclear, very muddy place together to achieve some common understanding of the current reality. Right? if we think about it, this ends up producing a much better grasp of the problem and the challenge that you're trying to solve. So what we find in my world is that a lot of innovation possibilities are lost at the stage of defining the problem, because the problem itself is defined in so narrow and conventional a way, it drives the real higher order thinking out of the entire decision process right at the beginning. So this question of the willingness to kind of muck around in this uncomfortable world of what is the problem really about, and to explore perspectives on that is a big deal. Number two, we talk a lot these days about curate. It teaches teams to curate. In a world of complexity, I love this quote, we've just got too much of everything, right? We're surrounded by too much music, too much software, too many websites, too many feeds, too many people, too many opinions. This is from Wired, talking about why curation is the new search, I think was the term of this article, right? Yeah, so what did search buy us? The ability to drown in ever more complex data sets, really, in some ways, right? How do we even know what to pay attention to? In this world where we talk about constraints and all, the single biggest constraint is often our capacity as human beings to only have 24 hours in a day and to be able to pay attention to so much information without getting overwhelmed, right? So in some ways, the most critical resource we've got as individuals is how we manage our own time and our own focus, and how we figure out what to focus on and pay attention to in situations where there's just more than we can ever know. And here we find this notion of design criteria becomes really critical. One of the things that this approach does is, as it explores the context of the problem very deeply, eventually it tries to translate all that knowing of the problem into a clear and short set of design criteria. Now, for engineers, that's probably pretty obvious. For business people, that was kind of a revelation. Wow, you mean if we actually agreed on what the performance dimensions were of the solution, we'd argue less about which solution is actually best, right? That's turned out, that kind of notion of drilling down to what's really important and figuring out how to tell the story in a way that cuts through the noise. Because this is the other dilemma we've got. We can solve problems, but we just can't get anybody else's attention to pay attention to our solution, right? So part of the issue here is, how do we tell a story that helps this person we're trying to bring into collaboration with us get as excited as we are about what we're talking about? Probably not by showing them that, that detailed specifications chart that is the most wonderful thing we think has ever been created, right? We have to tell the story to them through what they think is important and what their knowledge is. So this whole idea of curation as the new search, I think, is a really interesting one, and design helps with that. We've still got a lot to learn on that one. The third, though, is it really can drive the search for higher ground versus common ground. And again, higher ground versus common ground is the place that diverse teams go wrong most dysfunctionally, I think. So when we look at what I was talking about, this idea of satisficing versus optimizing, in order to find the solution that best meets our criteria, one, we have to agree on the problem, and two, we have to agree on the criteria for the solution. And this is where design thinking begins to contribute, because there are a set of communal tools that can leverage difference to be a positive force versus a negative. And again, I won't go into lots of details on them now, but they are tools like the use of visualization. Design has some very structured sense-making processes around how you look for insights as a collective. So there's a mind mapping tool we do. We did it with the faculty not long ago. If you can put 70 University of Virginia Business School faculty in a room for a couple of hours and get them to agree on anything, you've accomplished a tremendous thing. So we've used this mind mapping technique quite successfully in these ways. And again, it's just a structured process, of course involving Post-it notes, which almost anything does these days, and clustering of Post-it notes and insight extraction, and then you translate insights into design criteria. Again, at some high level, it's completely self-evident that this should be something we should all have thought of ourselves sooner, but calling it a tool and making it structured really makes a difference. Assumption testing, prototyping, critical. We're talking about a very different kind of prototyping than traditional research and development, though. This notion of prototyping is using prototypes as catalysts for conversations, not as like, here's our beta and it worked. Literally, Michael Schrage talks about the difference between treating a prototype as a dress rehearsal versus a playground. This is prototypes as playgrounds. We don't care if they work. We don't actually even care if the person we show them to likes them. In fact, it's kind of better if they don't, because we actually get more information out of them if they don't like it when they tell us why, right? So even traditional techniques like prototyping is really useful. Experimentation and reflection. We know that improvements and new learning only happen if experiments are interspersed with deep reflection on what the experiment says, right? And again, building that into a process can be terribly useful. So the result, this is what we hope for if it works with teams. That essentially we not only remove the barriers to collaboration, but we increase speed. Speed is a big deal in my world. I mean, you could do the same thing slowly, and it's not worth nearly as much as if you can do that same thing much more quickly. As we focused on speed, we've realized how much group process is a huge obstacle to doing anything quickly. We all know if they would just let us do it ourselves, we could have gotten it done yesterday. But God help us if there's a committee, right? I mean, it just extends on endlessly, right? How does it do it? Well, part of what we're talking about is we've talked about engaging people in the work, people taking ownership by actually being part of the discussion and the definition of the problem and the design criteria. If people have ownership of the design criteria, the speed with which you can agree on a solution is vastly improved. We've talked about alignment. We're trying to align our definition of the problems, align our definition of current reality. You know, if you're trying to create a new future, we tend to go right to the new future and try and align people on that. Almost impossible if you haven't already aligned them on this notion of what's actually happening today. If we can't tell the truth and agree on what's happening today, the odds of actually changing anything are significantly reduced. And then finally, this notion of helping people pay attention to the really what's only important. That's where FAST comes from. And if we compare that to the reality of at least many of the teams in my world, instead of engagement, you've got inertia. People don't really care. They just show up to the meeting because they have to. Right? Then they skip the next meeting, and you spend the third meeting repeating to them what they missed when they skipped the second meeting. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous, right? You've got politics of difference instead of alignment. You've got confusion and overwhelming amounts of data versus curation. So not surprising that what you get out of those processes is something that's incredibly slow instead of something that's incredibly fast. Right? So that's really our goal. You know, I mean, we're all tired of hearing the mantra from Silicon Valley of fail fast and cheap. But increasingly, in the world we live in, of wicked problems and limited resources, failing fast and cheap together is, in fact, probably the most efficient way to learn and to achieve breakthrough solutions. So thank you for being so patient. As always, I talk longer than I thought I would. So thank you. So we have some time for questions. Where to begin? See,
Professor?
Yes.
Would you say, though, that in terms of George and Jeff, that in some situations people can be either one?
Yes.
We're not all entirely one or the other. It depends on the circumstances and risk.
Completely. What Dweck calls these mindsets is preferences. So we generally have a preference for one or the other, and the power of preferences is that without awareness, we don't even know we have a preference. We think that's just the way the world is. So part of what we're trying to do here is the more you can raise people awareness of these different kind of decision attitudes, the more I can consciously choose one versus the other. So at any point in time, George can make a choice more in line with the learning mindset. But unless he's thinking about that, chances are he's going to naturally go with the most comfortable mindset, which is fixed. We often find that a lot of us, you know, when we go out to learn the game of golf, we have a different mindset than when we're at work doing our specialized area. So mindset is much more fluid than kind of the stark portrayal that we've made it here, but awareness is critical to it being fluid. With lack of awareness, it tends to be sticky. Dweck's also demonstrated that you can shift people's awareness, shift their mindset too, with kind of devices and tactics. I mean, for instance, one of the things they've been studying, I don't know if people saw the New York Times Magazine cover story a couple of weeks ago. It was about the University of Texas doing this interesting work to try and keep at-risk students in college. I mean, not surprisingly, students from disadvantaged backgrounds and students from high schools that are not as good, their odds of dropping out in the first 6 months of a rigorous university experience are incredibly high. So and part of it is the fixed mindset, right? I've been smart my whole life. I've been the head of my class, and all of a sudden I get to UT and I get an F in a calculus test. Oh my God, my world falls apart, right? Whereas the rest of us would kind of go, oh, well, you know, I got an F in a calculus test. I better go see the teacher and see if I can get them to raise it to a D. So they've done these very simple techniques, like they take these kids in the first week of class and they have them listen to someone talk about the struggles they had when they started college. Then they have the exercise that they have to write a letter to someone else based on, you know, how you get to college, and it's kind of hard, and you know, it's not high school anymore, and they have like halved the dropout rate in this disadvantaged group. And that's a mindset shift, right? I accept that I'm going to get it wrong sometimes, and I accept that there's going to be hurdles and obstacles. It's not me. Paradoxically, often it's high achievers who have the most difficulty learning when you push them out of their boundaries. We go into this death spiral, you know, like, oh my God, I've always been right. Suddenly, I got it wrong, and you know, your whole world crumbles. So there's a lot of very interesting work around mindset, I think, that's very broadly applicable across a lot of different fields. Yeah. Please.
So even when you can agree on the initial problem, when you still have those butting heads, say there's only 4 of you, and you guys can't agree, and you don't want to come up with the least worst solution.
Yeah.
Do you drop someone? How does that work?
Yeah, exactly. That's where experimentation is supposed to work. In an ideal world, we first try and listen clearly to understand where the other person is coming from and why they believe what they believe, right? So rather than debating solution, pros and cons, we go to, let's unpack the assumptions underlying why you believe what you believe. And then let's ask, is there data we could go get to test that assumption, right? I mean, at some point, instead of endlessly debating, usually debates are associated with we are making a fundamentally different assumption about the world. Now, at some objective level, one of us is making an assumption that is more true than the others, right? Now, chances are I've bounded my assumptions in a certain category, so they could all be true. But what you have to do is put those assumptions on the table, which is hard, right? Examining our own assumptions about why we believe what we believe can be challenging. But the trick is to put those assumptions on the table and then try and go get some data to test them. So for instance, I find when we're really locked in a debate at the university, one of the things I say is, okay, is there a piece of data that if we could get it, would resolve this debate, right? What don't we know that if we knew, we could move on, accept one and move on, right? We also find that with design thinking, one of the basic rules of thumb is when you find yourself debating, move out of that part of the decision somewhere else, right? Because people tend to lock down, right? Oftentimes, if you move to a different question, it loosens up your ability to go back, then circle back to another question with a broader view of the question, right? So not getting stuck is critical too. There's like a time limit, like you're allowed to debate for like 10 minutes and then guess what? Give that one up and move someplace else. Take the team somewhere else, and then we'll come back to that and see when we've learned a little more. See, this is the issue. The only way you break that logjam of different perspectives is through learning, and nobody learns anything sitting in a conference room debating someone else. The only way you learn is if you break the logjam of the conference room and go find out some new insight that you didn't have before to bring back into the group to dislodge it, right? So avoiding that lockdown and saying, what could we learn that would help us make a choice? And then recognize, we're usually talking about a portfolio of ideas here. You're never sure you're going to be right. right? So you never want to double down on just, if you have a group of smart people in the room and they are that bitterly opposed, there's probably a level of uncertainty around the decision that it really doesn't matter which one you make. You better have great contingency plans because there's some high probability that there's an uncertainty in there that you're viewing differently, right? And so even there, that kind of level of debate among people, especially at a tactical level, right? In specialized information, it's not politics that we're debating, it's something that theoretically is real, right? If you get, the idea that there's just one right answer is almost there. I mean, this is where, traditionally we would use a tool called scenario planning in strategy, which is you take your high uncertainties that we really disagree, and you pivot a collection of them to create different scenarios. And then instead of hammering yourself over which one is right, you say, well, let's take what we're trying to accomplish and let's look at what happens to it in each of the different scenarios. Okay? That too opens up the conversation, right? So a lot of this, interestingly enough, is about the quality of the conversation. It's interesting, in this world of technology we live in, where we can make possible all kinds of crazy things we would never have believed, in the end, new knowledge breakthroughs come from a group of human beings working together, almost always. And their ability to produce those kind of outcomes is a function of the quality of conversation they have. But how many of us have ever had anyone spend more than about an hour telling us how to have a really high quality conversation that maximizes the chance we'll get to higher order solutions together? Virtually none of us, right? Even in business. I mean, in science, it's one thing, but in business, you'd think we'd be doing that, but we don't for the most part, right? We ignore the fact that the single most powerful tool that anybody has to create new knowledge is how they manage a conversation. And so a lot of what swamps us in these diverse stakeholder conversations is not evil intent on the part of anyone, or even sometimes not lack of knowledge or lack of data. It's just the fact that we don't know how to talk across difference in a way that channels that difference into the positive force for innovation instead of thinking us in some other mode. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? It still all comes back to conversation. I think probably time for one more question.
I've been listening to what you saying and overlaying it on the way NASA does business, not because I want to criticize it, but what I'm doing is a similarity and difference filter. And I think that a lot of what you're saying is already cooked into NASA's process. So for example, if we decide we want to have a new mission to Mars, the first thing we do, and it's a very structured process, is we do something called a mission concept review, where we sit around and think about what the mission ought to be. The next step is a system concept review, the system that should do it. The third step is a system requirements review. So we're 3 steps into this and we're still in your first bubble. Okay? Then we move into the design thinking. The only is so in a sense, I say number one that what you're saying should resonate with a lot of us people at NASA who have to overcome these challenges. But on the other hand, we don't get an opportunity to experiment with sending 10 things to Mars. Right?
Yep.
We've got to cut to one decision, make it, and we do. I think our playing around in the level of technology development, which is a piece part thing, not an end state system. So a comment, your reflection.
Yes. I think in some ways, we're taught to value decisiveness in decision making. And we know that it's, even in my world, at some point, if you're afraid to make the big bets, you're never going to get anywhere. Paradoxically, what design thinking would say is you should avoid commitment as long as possible. Now, that you can't avoid commitment forever and get the things done that you need to do, but oftentimes I think we rush to premature commitment because of our own anxiety around the process of making a decision that big. Completely offside. I was reading some interesting research about the other day about divorce, and it was arguing that one major reason why people get divorced is they're tired of thinking about whether or not they should get divorced. They're thinking, what the hell, let's just do it. Let's just get divorced, right? And it's our own anxiety with a big decision, right, that causes us sometimes to make a decision before we absolutely have to, only so we can stop thinking about that decision. And in some cases, I think that's probably the best that you could do. There are going to be big bets and big commitments that you need to make. The more you can maintain, kind of balance the need for speed in a mission with this deferral of that, figuring out which 9 of the 10 to kill until the last minute, that's probably the best that you can do in the reality of the complex world you live in, where if you're not willing to make big bets, you're never going to get to the moon. Right? Maybe one last quick one, and then because I think we're at 10:20.
So I think all of us here really like the idea of Jeffs, right? We want to be the Jeffs and hire the Jeffs and work with the Jeffs. So I'm going to ask I'm taking a question on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Do we need some of the Georges? And if so, at what percentage?
Yeah. We think a lot about this in business, right? Because everybody wants the Jeffs, because that's the easy way out from a leader's viewpoint, right? I'll tell you about Jeff. Jeff is what we call high maintenance. I can look at most of the people in my study that is now only about 6 years old. Most of them work somewhere else now. These are people who are innovative, they're full of energy, and when you frustrate them, they always believe there's someplace else that will take them and they'll work with them. Now, that probably isn't true with NASA. You guys, it's like working for Disney in animation. You kind of have a lockdown, probably, on whole categories of people where you can make them infinitely more miserable than we could in business and they still won't leave. Right? That is a huge advantage. I don't think you want to minimize that, right? But assuming, that that's true, in general, you need a complement of Jeffs, particularly Jeffs in leadership roles, I will tell you. Because George in a leadership role, if you're not careful, really can shut down innovation effectively in a whole team, right? So it helps to have the Jeffs of the world who are a little bit more willing to hang around and deal with the bureaucracy that they live in, be there for the team. But you need a goodly number of Georges, because I will tell you, the problem with Jeff in our world is he is overly optimistic and a bad hypothesis tester. He's a good hypothesis generator and a bad tester. And in an ideal world, the beauty of experimentation is you can take the Jeffs of the world and they can generate those ideas, but make them listen to the tests that the Georges of the world think they need to commit to, right? That's the model. Having George veto any action on the part of all the Jeffs is a dead end. So it's a combination of the two that you need. I think the percentage would depend upon your mission as an institution, right? Most business organizations live and die by continuing to deliver today's product reliably and efficiently to today's customers. If you drop the ball on that, all the innovation in the world is not going to help you, right? So you might find in a lot of traditional business organizations, the odds are, it's 20-80 Jeff to George, or it's 30-70 Jeff to George. Now, when you're a research and development organization, I'm willing to bet, you need a higher proportion of Jeffs to George. But I have a lot of confidence in George, right? Maybe that's because I'm a teacher, right? So under what conception of the world would I ever think it was a good idea to decide someone could learn, right? But I believe that the problem with George, a lot of times in our world, is we have trained him. We've beaten the Jeff out of him at various points in his or her education. And sometimes all you have to do is issue the invitation and make it safe for the Jeff to come back, right? So I like to think that, in the business world at least, these techniques for creative thinking are will go the way of total quality management. There was a point when TQM first came in that you had experts who did TQM, and everybody did their job, and then you had your quality people over here. Well, today, every manager thinks quality is part of their job, right? It's baked into what it means to be a manager, is to care about quality. Now, when you have a tough quality problem, you go get the experts. But this idea of quality is embedded in everyone's job definition. I feel like innovation needs to be embedded in everyone's job definition. Some of the capabilities that design thinking brings needs to be embedded in everyone's job definition, right? And then you need the people for whom it's 90% of their job, right? And they're again in a different category. So again, I know those it depends answers are common, but it's easy to make George the villain in this, but you know, as someone who teaches at a business school, hey, we're 90% about whipping people into George, you know, and Jeff's an outlier. All right, well, I would promise to be finished at 10:20, so we have a little violation of that, but thank you.
I just wanted to thank Professor Liedtke one more time. She came here on her own time and dime to do this for us, and we really appreciate it. It was wonderful. So thank you again.